Hi, my name is Dr. Selena Phillips, and I'm a faculty member at California State University, Chico in Northern California. Welcome to Applied Animal Feeding. This video series that we will be developing is going to be discussing the nutrient requirements for animals, specifically livestock. We're going to do that through first defining what is a nutrient requirement. We're going to talk about what it is and what it isn't, understanding its limitations. Second, we're going to describe factors that are affecting nutrient requirements. We're also going to define how nutrient requirements are determined and where they come from. And then the final videos will be talking about how stages of production can impact nutrient requirements, considering if an animal's growing, getting ready to be bred, gestation or pregnancy, or even lactating, all can impact an animal's nutrient requirements. When we talk about nutrient requirements from a livestock perspective, one of the things we need to understand to be a successful feeder is first and foremost the digestion and absorption of nutrients for our specific animal, and how that changes throughout their lifetime, because animals can shift how they digest and absorb nutrients. So now, one of the things in my class that we first develop a foundation in is digestion and absorption of nutrients. The second element that we discuss is selecting an appropriate feed. A feed that fills a need, whether it's a protein or energy feed or a mineral, but also one that is available in the region, affordable, and going to accomplish the goals that the nutritionist is working towards. The last thing and what this series of videos is specifically going to address is animal nutrient requirements, the quantity of each nutrient needed by the animal and what impacts those requirements and what we need to adjust for as nutritionists. The first thing we need to understand is a couple of terms that you'll hear is a nutrient requirement or a nutrient allowance. A requirement is usually considered the minimum amount an animal would need to meet a specific goal. This is usually the quantity of a nutrient that is the average animal's need, not that specific animal. So sometimes an animal maybe needs a little less or maybe needs a little more. So we're shooting for the average of a group, not the individual animal. And that can leave some animals a little bit short of a nutrient and some animals getting too much. But as a nutritionist, we generally don't worry as much about too much as making sure all of the animals are getting the minimum amount that they need. So that's where the concept of an allowance comes in, a nutrient allowance. That's the quantity of a nutrient that's a little bit greater than the minimum required. It's creating a safety margin to allow for the individual variation that we may see between animals. We've got a graphic to help kind of visualize how these work, and coming up in a slide or two. And it kind of starts dealing with this concept that we have of optimal production. We need to understand that requirements are a guide. They're not inflexible. They're just a guide and a starting place, and that we should be critical thinkers and evaluators of a situation and make adjustments as we need to. Larger allowances may be made in case of certain nutrients that a specific group of animals may be needing. The bottom line is that as a nutritionist, we're looking to figure out what is that optimal production level for our animals, whether it's maintenance, it's growth at a specific rate, it's supporting a pregnancy, it's milking a certain amount, producing eggs, whatever our example is. So we need to make sure that we're supporting that level of production. It may be more or different from that minimum requirement or that allowance. And so when we put that all in perspective from a visual standpoint, this is what we get. The first thing we're dealing with is if we take a look that we've got the amount of nutrient on the bottom axis in an increasing level. So as nutrient goes up, we're seeing this bell-shaped curve. We also have animal performance on the y-axis. So as more nutrients, generally we'll see an impact on animal performance. But like everything, there is a law of diminishing returns. We can keep pouring in a nutrient, but it can actually negatively impact animal performance. So we want to make sure our goal is to be in this optimal range. This is where we want to be, in that optimal range. Whether it's a lamb that we want to gain 3/4 pound a day, a feedlot steer that we're pushing to get over 3 pounds a day of gain on them, whatever the case may be. Now, as a nutritionist, as we're talking about this requirement, allowance, those types of concepts, the requirement is that minimum requirement that comes in. Whoops, sorry, I can't really draw a straight line. But it's right here where that marginal level is borderline deficiency. So we're saying they need at least this much to support maintenance and whatever basic production we have going on. Now, as a nutritionist, we may try to bump that up a little bit to start getting on the cusp of this optimal range. And this is what we would call the allowance, is this space right here. That it's a little bit more than the minimum requirement, but it's not quite to optimal production yet. So as a nutritionist, you need to be aware of when it's a minimal requirement that you're good with, or we need to do an allowance, or we're trying to really get up to this optimal range and find that. For most of our situations, this is where we want to be, but how do we get there? And that's something we're going to explore in future video sessions. Now, the one thing that we do want to be careful of with nutrients is some nutrients we can have too much. An example is copper in sheep can be toxic. And so we usually don't add a lot of copper to sheep diets because most of the feeds contain an adequate amount and we don't need any extra because that's going to push them beyond this upper marginal bracket and into toxicity. Another example is that we don't want to go the other direction, is we don't want to get below that minimum requirement. We're going to create a deficiency setting, and that is going to impact animal health and well-being, and that is something we definitely do not want to do. There are several things that can impact animal requirements. The first is species. Cows and pigs and poultry, they all have different requirements. And so we need to understand species-specific requirements. Within a species, the breed can have a huge impact. In companion animals, if we think about dogs, Great Danes probably do not have the same nutrient requirements as a Chihuahua does. And so that breed can have a major impact. Gender, absolutely. In the swine industry, a lot of times we do split sex feeding, meaning we feed the castrated males, called a barrow, separate from the females that are growing, that we call gilts. And so when we're doing that, we're trying to make sure that each gender is getting the specific nutrients they need to optimize their growth. Age of an animal, just like in people, can affect the nutrient requirements. Basal metabolism, this one's big. This is our major nutrient cost in our livestock, is whatever's going to what we call maintenance, or that basal metabolic rate. That's a big expense for most livestock producers and anybody feeding animals. Physiological status, whether they're growing, pregnant, lactating, whatever the case may be, that's going to affect how much nutrients they need. Their health status, to keep animals healthy, they need to have adequate nutrients. If they're sick, we may have to supplement some nutrients to help them heal and recover. So understanding health impact is big as well. And finally, the environment, an absolute contributor to nutrient requirements. It must be considered. Where we're at, Northern California, we can deal with quite a bit of heat stress during the summer, and we need to have an understanding for that. Where do these nutrient requirements come from? It's a great question. There is actually a national committee, the National Research Council, and they have subcommittees. There's one on beef, dairy, swine, equine, small ruminants, poultry, fish, lab animals, a variety, primates I think too, or even a subcommittee. And so this committee, their task is to be current and relevant on the literature. And about every 7 or so years, I don't know the exact timeline, they will go through and review the literature and create a publication that is modified for these nutrient requirements. It's all about what have we learned over the past several years and how does that impact our decision making as nutritionists. Now we can see requirements in two forms in most of these publications. Either as a table where you look up on the side, beef cow weighing 1,000 pounds, and then I need her energy requirement. And you move your fingers across and you get a number. That's a table. But more and more common, we're starting to see equations, where variables, like we talked about on the previous slide, breed, gender, stage of production, climate or environment, all of those factors are taken in for, calculated, and nutrient requirements are adjusted based on the specific situation those animals are in. And that is obviously the more accurate way to do it, but it is still a modeling, thinking about computer modeling and trying to predict these nutrient requirements. But that's where they're coming from, is this NRC publication. We're going to see requirements expressed one of two ways. The first is just daily intake. How many pounds, calories, grams does an animal need every day? That's it. And that is the most accurate way to express a requirement, because if I know that my sheep need 1/2 pound of protein a day, I can figure out how much to feed to make sure they're getting their need. The second form is proportion of the diet. Now this is the concentration. Percentage, parts per million, parts per billion, calories per pound of feed. All of those are concentrations. And what this depends on is assuming the animal's going to eat enough to make it work. And so when you're dealing with balancing rations on a proportion basis, you have to consider intake along with it. Whereas on a quantity basis, the daily intake of a nutrient, you're taking into account just that they're going to eat that, how much they need per day. Proportion of the diet or concentration, you have to add in intake as well. Whereas the first one has it included, the second one you have to account for it. That wraps up the first video as an overview of nutrient requirements and where they come from. The second video in this series is going to talk about maintenance and the maintenance requirements for livestock and what goes into it. Thank you.